November 1878. Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. Nobody noticed what was happening at the widow's cabin. From the road, it looked like every other homestead dotting the valley floor. Small, rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney leaning slightly east, a single window facing south. But as the first snows dusted the peaks above, something strange became visible, or rather, invisible. Every cabin for miles had massive wood piles, cords stacked 8 feet high, covered in bark and canvas. Some families had enough timber to build a second house. But the end of the wagon trail, where the creek bent north and the lodgepole pines gave way to open meadow, one cabin had almost nothing. Just a woman, a small shed, and a thin ribbon of smoke that never seemed to stop. People talked. They assumed she was unprepared, foolish, that she'd come begging before Christmas. But when the brutal cold arrived and neighbors started burning through their stockpiles faster than expected, that tiny cabin stayed warm. Warmer, some said, than homes 3 times its size. What she understood about moisture, airflow, and earth temperature would eventually change how an entire valley stored fuel. But first, winter had to prove her right. If you want to see one historical survival technique every week that actually kept people alive when it mattered most, hit subscribe right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Her name was Nora Clement, 34 years old, widow of 9 months. No children, no extended family within 200 miles. Just her a quarter section of land her husband had filed on 3 years prior, and a cabin he'd barely finished before a logging accident took him in February. She wasn't from Montana. She'd grown up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where winter lasted 7 months, and you learned to think ahead or you didn't make it to spring. Her father had been a surveyor. Her mother, a schoolteacher who spoke 3 languages and could calculate board feet in her head faster than most men with pencil and paper. Nora had inherited both the practicality and the mathematics. By late September, when the aspens turned gold and the temperature started dropping after sunset, most homesteaders were in full preparation mode. Felling dead, standing timber, splitting rounds, stacking cord after cord in long rows that cast shadows across their dooryards like sundials. Nora was doing something else. She was digging, not a root cellar. Those are common enough. This was different, deeper, and located 30 feet from her cabin, near the base of a slight rise where the ground stayed dry even during spring melt. Her nearest neighbor, a man named Callum Brody, watched her from his own property line one afternoon in early October. He'd been hauling timber with his 2 sons, and they'd stopped to water the horses near the creek. "She's digging a grave," his youngest said, only half joking. Callum shook his head. "Too wide, too shallow at the entry." "Then what is it?" He didn't answer. He didn't know. What Nora was building wasn't in any manual. It wasn't taught in any carpentry guild or discussed in any farming journal. It was something she'd seen once as a girl at a Scandinavian homestead near Lake Superior. A storage chamber dug horizontally into a hillside, lined with stone, ventilated carefully, and kept just above freezing year-round by the steady temperature of undisturbed earth. Not for food, for firewood. By mid-October, when the first hard frost turned the meadow grass white and brittle, Nora had finished the excavation. She'd reinforced the entrance with salvaged timbers from an old flume. She dug a shallow drainage trench to route any groundwater away from the chamber. And she'd cut ventilation gaps near the roof to allow air circulation without letting in precipitation. Then she started filling it, 1 wheelbarrow load at a time. Dry lodgepole pine, seasoned Douglas fir, split aspen that had been stacked in the sun all summer. She rolled each log down a gentle ramp and stacked it carefully inside the underground chamber, leaving gaps for airflow. It took her 3 weeks. When she was done, she covered the entrance with a hinged wooden hatch, camouflaged it with sod and dead grass, and built a small rock cairn nearby so she could find it under snow. From the road, her property looked bare, like she'd done nothing at all. Callum Brody mentioned it to his wife one evening over supper. "That widow," he said, shaking his head. "She's got maybe a week's worth of what's stacked outside. I don't know what she's thinking." His wife glanced toward the window, toward the distant glow of Nora's chimney. Maybe she's planning to leave before the snow. Maybe, Callum said, but he didn't believe it. Nobody did. By early November, it became a topic of casual conversation. At the trading post in Stevensville, men gathering supplies for the winter would mention it in passing. You seen the Clement place? Hardly any wood. She's not going to make it past Thanksgiving. Some felt sorry for her. A few offered help. Callum himself rode out one afternoon with a load of split pine and knocked on her door. She thanked him politely and said she was managing just fine. He left the wood anyway, stacked it near her shed, and rode home feeling uneasy. The wood was still there a week later, untouched. What Callum couldn't see, what nobody could see unless they knew exactly where to look, was the small trapdoor near the base of the hillside, 30 feet from Nora's front door. It was positioned where the slope provided natural drainage and where the soil composition was dense clay mixed with glacial stone, the kind of substrate that held stable temperatures even when the surface froze solid. Every 3 days, Nora would walk out with a canvas sling, open the hatch, and descend 5 wooden steps into the chamber below. The air inside was cool, but not cold. Dry. Still, the kind of environment that prevented rot and kept seasoned wood from absorbing atmospheric moisture. She'd load the sling with enough logs for 72 hours, close the hatch, and return to her cabin. The whole process took less than 10 minutes. From a distance, it looked like she was checking a snare line or fetching something from a shed. Nobody thought twice about it. Meanwhile, other homesteads were discovering a problem. Late autumn in the Bitterroot Valley that year had been unusually wet. 2 weeks of cold rain in mid-October had soaked every exposed woodpile in the region. Most settlers had tarps or bar coverings, but water still found its way in through gaps, seams, and wind-damaged sections. And then the temperature dropped. By the 3rd week of November, daytime highs were barely reaching 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Nighttime lows were dipping below zero. The moisture trapped inside those massive wood piles began to freeze. Logs that had seemed dry in September were now sheathed in frost. Splitting them required twice the effort. Burning them produced half the heat and 3 times the smoke. Chimneys clogged with creosote. Fires sputtered. Families started burning through their reserves faster than expected, trying to compensate for the reduced efficiency of frozen, damp wood. At Nora's cabin, the smoke from her chimney remained steady. Thin, consistent. The kind of smoke that comes from bone-dry, fuel burning hot and clean. Callum noticed. So did others. One evening in late November, a man named Joseph Harker stopped by Callum's place. Harker was a freighter, a man who spent half the year hauling goods between Missoula and the Bitterroot settlements. He'd seen a lot of homesteads. He knew what worked and what didn't. I rode past the Clement cabin today, Harker said, warming his hands by Callum's stove. She's burning clean, real clean, and I don't see where she's getting the wood. Callum poured him coffee. She's got a small stack by the shed, maybe 2 weeks' worth. That stack's in the same size for a month, Harker said. I passed it 4 times. Hasn't changed. Callum frowned. You saying she's not using it? I'm saying something doesn't add up. Harker left an hour later, but the question stayed with Callum. That night, lying in bed while wind rattled the shutters, he ran the numbers in his head. Nora's cabin was small, maybe 300 square feet. A single room, but even a small cabin in this kind of cold required a significant amount of fuel to stay livable. At least a quarter cord per week if the wood was good and the stove was efficient. She didn't have that much visible. So where was she getting it? Nora hadn't invented the idea. She'd learned it from an old Norwegian man named Christopher back in Michigan when she was 13. Her family had been visiting a remote homestead near the Keweenaw Peninsula, and Christopher had shown her father a storage chamber he'd dug into a south-facing hillside. Not for potatoes or turnips, but for firewood. Ground stays 45, 50 degrees all winter, Christopher had explained in his thick accent. No wind, no wet, no freeze. You keep wood there, it stays dry like summer. Her father had been skeptical. Wouldn't it rot? Underground, Christopher shook his head. Not if you ventilate. Not if you drain water away. Not if ground is stable. He tapped the clay-rich soil with his boot. This kind of ground, dense, holds temperature, doesn't shift. Nora had never forgotten it. When her husband died, and she found herself alone on Montana homestead with limited resources and no way to process the sheer volume of firewood most families stockpiled, she remembered Christopher's hillside chamber. And she adapted it. The excavation had taken 2 weeks. She'd used a mattock, a shovel, and an iron pry bar to break through the dense clay and glacial cobble. The chamber itself was 10 feet deep, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet tall at the center, just high enough for her to stand upright. She'd dug it horizontally into the slope, angling slightly upward toward the back to prevent water accumulation. The entrance was a narrow shaft, descending 5 feet at a gentle angle, reinforced with salvaged timber framing. She'd positioned it on the downslope side of the hill so that any groundwater would naturally flow away from the chamber rather than into it. Ventilation was critical. She'd punched 2 narrow gaps near the roof of the chamber, each covered with a wooden grate to keep out animals and debris. These gaps allowed slow air exchange without creating drafts that would pull in moisture or drop the temperature too low. The science was simple but effective. Underground, below the frost line, the Earth maintains a relatively stable temperature year-round. In the Bitterroot Valley, that temperature hovers between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on depth and soil composition. Cold enough to prevent rot and insect activity. Warm enough to keep wood from freezing and absorbing surface moisture. Firewood stored in this environment stayed as dry as the day it was cut. No rain, no snow, no freeze-thaw cycles that caused splitting and checking. No wind-driven moisture, just stable, cool, dry air. Nora had stacked nearly 2 full cords inside the chamber by the time the first snow fell. Enough to last her through March, even if the winter was brutal. And because she only retrieved what she needed every few days, the chamber remained sealed most of the time, maintaining its stable environment. The hatch itself was a masterpiece of simple engineering. She'd built it from 2 layers of planking with a gap in between, creating a crude but effective insulating barrier. The exterior surface was covered with sod, making it nearly invisible under snow. A leather strap on the underside allowed her to pull it closed from inside after descending. The whole system had cost her almost nothing. Salvaged lumber, a few hours of hard digging, and the knowledge that underground storage wasn't just for vegetables. Nobody in the valley knew. And for a while, it didn't matter. The storm arrived the second week of December. It started as a low-pressure system moving south from Canada, colliding with moisture pushing up from the Snake River Plain. The result was 3 days of heavy, wet snow followed by a temperature drop so severe that the mercury in Callum Brody's thermometer contracted below the last marking. Minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of December 15th. And that was at sunrise. By midday, it hadn't climbed above zero. Across the valley, families retreated indoors and fed their stoves constantly. But the wood wasn't cooperating. Frozen logs hissed and steamed when placed in the firebox. They required more kindling, more airflow, more time to catch. And even when they burned, the heat output was noticeably lower. Ice crystals trapped in the wood fibers consumed energy as they melted, stealing BTUs that should have been warming the cabin. Chimneys became hazardous. The combination of damp wood and cold temperatures created ideal conditions for creosote buildup. Several families had chimney fires that week, brief, terrifying flare-ups that sent sparks shooting into the night sky and forced everyone outside in sub-zero temperatures to watch their roofs, praying the fire stayed contained. At Joseph Harker's place, the situation became desperate. His woodpile, stacked in a low area near his barn, had been completely saturated during the November rains. Now it was frozen solid. He and his 2 sons spent hours each day splitting frozen logs with wedges and sledgehammers, trying to expose dry wood in the centers. It was exhausting, dangerous work. One glancing blow could shatter a frozen log into shrapnel. Callum fared better. His woodpile was on higher ground and better covered. But even he noticed the difference. His stove was consuming nearly twice as much wood as it had in previous winters, and the cabin still felt colder. His wife stuffed rags around the window frames and hung blankets across the doorway to conserve heat. On the evening of December 16th, Callum rode out to check on Nora. The snow was knee-deep in places, and his horse struggled through the drifts. When he reached her property, he expected to find her in trouble. Low on fuel, cold, maybe ill. Instead, he found her hanging laundry. Not outside, it was far too cold for that. But she'd strung a line near her stove, and shirts and undergarments were drying in the warmth. The cabin's single window glowed orange with firelight. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady, narrow column. Callum dismounted and knocked. She answered quickly, and a wave of warm air rolled out into the frozen twilight. Not stifling heat, just comfortable warmth. The kind of warmth that meant a well-fed stove and good fuel. "Mr. Brody," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" He stood there, snowflakes catching in his beard, and realized he had no real reason for being there. He'd expected to offer help, to find her struggling. "Just checking in," he said finally. "Weather's rough." "It is," she agreed. "Would you like to come in? I have coffee." He hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the cabin was orderly and comfortable. The stove radiated steady heat. A pot of stew simmered on the cooktop. The air smelled like with smoke and bread she'd been baking. Callum accepted a cup of coffee and glanced at the wood box beside the stove. It was half full with split logs that looked completely dry. No frost, no dampness, just clean, seasoned wood. "Your wood's holding up well," he said carefully. "Yes," she replied. "I've been fortunate." He wanted to ask where it was coming from, how she kept it so dry. But there was something in her calm, self-sufficient manner that made the questions feel intrusive. Instead, he finished his coffee, thanked her, and rode home through the dark. Stay with me, because what happens next is going to show you exactly why her system saved her when everyone else was struggling. Hit that like button right now if you want to see how this plays out. 3 days later, Joseph Harker showed up at Nora's door. It was mid-morning, December 19th, and the temperature had finally climbed above 10 degrees for the first time in nearly a week. The sun was out, sharp and brittle in the sky, so blue it hurt to look at, but the cold was still dangerous. Exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Harker looked exhausted. His face was wind-burned, his beard crusted with ice from his own breath. He wasn't wearing gloves, Nora noticed immediately, and his hands were red and swollen. "Mrs. Clement," he said, his voice hoarse, "I need to ask you something." She stepped aside without a word and gestured him in. He stood by the stove, holding his damaged hands near the heat, but not too close. She poured him coffee and waited. "My wood's no good," he said finally. "Frozen through. We're burning twice what we should, and the house is still cold. My youngest has been coughing for 2 days." He paused, staring into the cup. "But your chimney, your smoke, it's been steady this whole time. Clean." Nora said nothing. "I'm not here to pry," Harker continued. "But if you got a method, if there's something you're doing different, I need to know. My family needs to know." There was no pride in his voice. No shame either. Just necessity. Nora set down her own cup and looked at him for a long moment. She'd known this conversation would come eventually. She'd hoped to avoid it, not out of selfishness, but because explaining always led to skepticism, and skepticism led to dismissal. People didn't trust solutions that seemed too simple. But Harker wasn't here to debate. He was here because his family was suffering. "Come with me," she said. She pulled on her coat and led him outside. The snow was packed firm now, easier to walk on. She headed toward the hillside, toward the spot where the small rock cairn marked the location. Harker followed, confused. When they reached the cairn, Nora knelt and brushed away a thin layer of snow, revealing the wooden hatch beneath. She lifted it. The leather strap on the underside made it easy despite the insulation weight and cold, dry air exhale from the opening below. Harker stared. "It's a storage chamber," Nora said simply. "Dug into the hillside, below the frost line. The earth temperature stays around 45 to 50 degrees year-round. Dry, stable. The wood stays exactly as dry as when I stored it." She descended the 5 steps and gestured for him to follow. Inside, Harker's eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light filtering through the ventilation gaps. The chamber was larger than he'd expected, and it was nearly full, stacks of split firewood arranged in neat rows with gaps between for airflow. He reached out and touched one of the logs. Completely dry. No frost. No moisture. It felt like summer wood. "How much is in here?" he asked quietly. "About a cord and a half left," Nora said. "I started with 2 full cords in October." Harker did the math in his head. 2 months. Half a cord consumed. That meant she was burning roughly a quarter cord per week. Exactly what you'd expect for a small, well-insulated cabin with an efficient stove and good fuel. But her fuel wasn't just good. It was perfect. "The key is ventilation," Nora continued, pointing toward the gaps near the roof. "Air needs to circulate, but slowly. Too much airflow, and you bring in moisture. Too little, and you risk condensation. These gaps are small enough to prevent drafts, but large enough to prevent stagnation." "And drainage?" Harker asked, his freighter's mind already working through logistics. "The entrance slopes upward toward the back," she explained. "Any groundwater flows away naturally. And the chamber is positioned where the soil is dense clay. It doesn't shift, doesn't crack, holds the temperature stable." Harker stood there, surrounded by dry firewood in the middle of a Montana winter, and felt something between relief and frustration. Relief because the solution was real. Frustration because it was so obvious in hindsight. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. Nora climbed back up the steps. Would they have listened? He thought about that. Thought about the way people talked about the widow with no woodpile. The assumptions. The condescension disguised as concern. "No," he admitted. "Probably not." She closed the hatch and covered it with snow. "You're welcome to replicate this at your place. The principles are simple. The work is manageable if you start early. And the results?" She gestured toward her cabin, toward the thin column of smoke still rising into the frozen sky. "The results speak for themselves." Harker nodded slowly. He was already planning the excavation in his mind. The location, the angle, the ventilation. "How long did it take you to dig?" he asked. 2 weeks, she said. "Working alone, a few hours each day." "I could do in a week with my sons," he said. "Maybe less." "Then you'll have dry wood next winter," Nora replied. "And the winter after that. And every winter, as long as you maintain the drainage and ventilation." They walked back to her cabin in silence. Before he left, Harker turned to her one more time. "Mrs. Clement," he said, "thank you. And I'm sorry." "For what?" "For assuming you didn't know what you were doing." She smiled slightly. "Everyone assumes that. I'm used to it." He rode away, and Nora went back inside. The stove needed feeding. She had bread to finish. And outside, the temperature was already dropping again as the sun arced toward the western peaks. But she wasn't worried. She had a cord and a half of bone-dry firewood waiting underground. Enough to last until March. Enough to prove that sometimes the best solutions weren't the loudest or the most visible. Sometimes they were just practical, patient, and buried where nobody thought to look. By January, 3 more families had dug storage chambers. Joseph Harker finished his first, working with his sons through the short daylight hours of late December. He positioned it on the south side of his property, where the slope provided natural drainage and the soil composition was favorable. His chamber was slightly larger than Nora's, 12 feet deep instead of 10, but the principles were identical. When he transferred his remaining wood from the frozen outdoor pile into the underground chamber, the difference was immediate. Within a week, the logs had shed their surface frost and returned to their natural moisture content. His stove began burning hotter and cleaner. His family stopped waking up to a cold house every morning. Callum Brody was next. He'd ridden out to see Harker's excavation in early January, and Harker had explained everything Nora had taught him. Callum went home, studied his own property, and chose a spot near the creek where a low ridge provided the perfect hillside angle. His version included a refinement. He lined the floor with a layer of river stone to improve drainage and prevent any moisture from wicking up into the wood. It added 3 days to the construction time, but the result was a chamber that stayed even drier than Nora's. By February, word had spread beyond the immediate valley. A rancher named William Pratt, living 15 miles north near the confluence of Sleeping Child Creek and the Bitterroot River, heard about the underground storage concept from a freighter passing through. He rode down to see Callum's chamber, spent an hour asking questions, and returned home to start his own excavation. Pratt's version was the largest yet, built to store wood for 2 cabins and a bunkhouse. He hired 2 men to help with the digging and finished the project in 5 days. By late February, he moved 4 full cords underground and reported that his fuel consumption had dropped by nearly 40% compared to previous winters. The technique spread organically, adapted to local conditions. In areas with rocky soil, people dug shallower chambers but compensated with better insulation on the hatch. In areas with high water tables, they positioned chambers higher on slopes and added more aggressive drainage trenches. Some people built wooden floors. Others left the earth bare but covered it with sand. Nobody called it revolutionary. Nobody wrote articles or filed patents. It was just practical knowledge, moving through a community the way useful information always had, person to person, problem to solution, winter to winter. Nora herself became a quiet point of reference. People would stop by in early spring, after the snow melted, to ask about ventilation gaps or drainage angles or soil composition. She answered every question plainly, without fuss, and sent them on their way. She never asked for credit, never pointed out that she'd been the first. It didn't matter to her. What mattered was that fewer families were struggling. Fewer children were coughing in cold houses. Fewer men were injuring themselves trying to split frozen logs with frozen hands. By the winter of 1879 to 1880, underground wood storage had become standard practice in the Bitterroot Valley. Not everywhere. Some people still preferred traditional wood piles, and that was fine. But enough families had adopted the method that it was no longer considered unusual. And in that transition from strange to normal, something important had been preserved. The idea that engineering didn't require formal education. That survival solutions could come from anyone willing to observe, adapt, and work. That a widow with a small cabin and a memory from childhood could solve a problem that experienced homesteaders had simply accepted as inevitable. In April 1880, a land surveyor from Missoula passed through the valley and noted in his journal, "Methods of fuel storage here are notably advanced. Many families utilize hillside chambers for dry wood conservation. Principle is sound, execution is simple, results are measurable. Estimate 30 to 40% improvement in fuel efficiency versus exposed pile storage." He didn't mention Nora by name, but in the valley, everyone knew. The technique outlasted her. When Nora eventually sold her homestead in 1889 and moved to Missoula to live with her sister's family, the new owner, a young couple from Wisconsin, kept the underground chamber maintained and functional. They used it for another 20 years before finally building a larger barn with dedicated wood storage. But by then, the principle had become regional knowledge. Scattered across western Montana, underground and semi-underground wood storage chambers appeared on dozens of homesteads. Some were elaborate, some were crude. All of them worked, and all of them traced back in one way or another to a widow who understood that the earth itself could be the best insulation, the best protection, and the best ally in a landscape where winter wasn't just a season. It was a test of every decision you'd made before it arrived. So here's my question for you. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your story. And if you learned something today that could actually help you or someone you know, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you one historical technique that worked when it really mattered. See you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.